Welcome to the Titans of Industry show. And you know what? I have a brilliant guest on for you today. I really enjoy having him on every single time. Actually, I like listening to him when he does interviews on other channels as well. He is Jim Rickard's partner in Meraglim.com. And it's a website and obviously a business that is an advisory for some very wealthy clients, institutional and accredited. And we get a chance now to glimpse into what the world of accredited investors are concerned about, especially systematic risk, which is what they focus on. So Kevin Messengill is with us today, and first of all, Kevin, how are you?
Good morning, Lior. Another lovely day in paradise. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you know what? I want to talk to you about. I don't want to talk to you about paradise. I want to talk to you a little bit about the troubles that we have. One very provocative question that I posed to Jim Rogers as well on my interview with him was, is the Fed now fighting multiple wars, multiple fronts at the same time? In other words, the domestic U.S. economy is quite robust right now. You have very low unemployment rates, official. You have rising wages. So 20 states have risen their minimum wages. You just have a 3 to 4% increase in wages, and then you have overtime. People are quitting. So the domestic economy is doing pretty well. It's not like people are prospering, but a lot more people are employed, and this is the recovery. In other words, this is peak capacity. Though Americans still suffer, this is America right now. This is peak capacity. So money velocity becomes a problem, and we could see inflation domestically in the U.S. So the Federal Reserve was thinking, how do I curb inflation? How do I raise interest rates? But then you see that when they say we're a long ways from being normal in October, you have a stock market sell-off in December because the stock market doesn't want high interest rates. So you have two clients that the Federal Reserve needs to service: the U.S. economy, which is in risk of generating some inflation, and the stock market, which is in risk of getting off the low interest rate drug. And obviously, if you want to blend that cocktail even further, they used to have global synchronization with all the other central banks. Everyone was lowering interest rates or raising them pretty much at the same time. Now you have conflicting ones. So can the Fed even do something productive in these sort of environments, or is it like Ray Dalio says, and they're quite out of tools in the toolbox?
So, first question, the thing that they could do that would be most productive, to follow the language or logic of Jim Grant, they should ceremoniously open an office with great flourish and fanfare for the Office of Unintended Consequences, and they should all retire and walk away. The Fed is a banking cartel designed not to prop up the U.S. government, not to prop up inflation, not to prop up unemployment or the value of the dollar. The banking cartel's there to protect the big banks who own it and their interests. That's their purpose. Now there's they don't say that every day publicly, because that would have people raising a bunch of uncomfortable questions, but that's what their purpose is. They're a banking cartel designed to protect the big banks. That's why they were created. They weren't created by a bunch of people altruistically thinking they were going to help protect Americans, smooth economic cycles, and make sure. That's all nonsense. That's just that's children's bedtime stories. Now, to answer your question, they're not trying to destroy the world. These people aren't stupid. They're smart people, and they're not necessarily evil. They're trying to do the best they can. But imagine if you and I were back in the Soviet Union, and it was our job to try and help manage the central economy, the planning economy, and we're gonna do our task. We have to set the price of goods and services, 2 million different light items a month. We got paid. There's no computers, right? It's just us, you and me, stacks of paper and pencils. Hey, Lior, what do we charge for steel? What do we think steel's price ought to be this month? I don't know. What did we charge for coal last month? Right? I mean, You can tell at a glance that is just a nonsensical, silly thing, that somehow you can replace price signals and manage an economy from a central standpoint, right? This is Hayek's fatal conceit on steroids. Well, I would tell you that the Fed in the United States and the central banks of the rest of the governments are exactly the same as the Soviet Gosplan central planners trying to manage the price of milk and coal and women's products. I mean, it's just insanity. Instead, what our masters of the universe have set themselves up to do, rather than try to do price manipulation at the retail level, they're doing price manipulation at the currency level, which of course is 50%, it's the other half of the trade of every trade that takes place outside of barter, right? So rather than try to attack all these disparate prices of all these different goods and services, they went to the other side of the trade. They're just manipulating the price of the currency side of the trade, right? It's way more efficient, but it's exactly the same problem. If you divorce yourself from price signals, you have no idea if what you're doing is creating value or destroying value. And so these people literally have no idea what they're doing. Ben Bernanke told my partner, Jim Rickards, once, this is an experiment. It's literally the words he used. Really? Okay, most people understand that experiments generally don't turn out well, right? They're a search for knowledge. Sometimes you get good results, sometimes you don't. You're experimenting with an entire nation, 350 million people's pensions and livelihoods, and you hope it'll work out? And Bernanke's answer was, well, we won't know. We won't know for 40 or 50 years from now until some historian writes it up. Think of the arrogance. Think of the criminal, insane arrogance that entails. One of my account executives was in a meeting. I won't tell you what city because I don't want to bust the guy out. But they were a group of CEOs, and they were being talked to or given a speech to by a former head of quantitative analysis for one of the regional Federal Reserve banks. And his comment to this group, this was just maybe 2 weeks ago, his comment was, we have the same quantitative tools we've had for 40 years. We all know they don't work, but it's what we got, and so it's what we use. So to answer your question, so let me take exception with another brief description you had. So yes, wage rates are rising. I don't believe a minimum wage law is a good thing or an indicator of a good thing. I think it's the opposite. I view that exactly the same way as if you told me people were doing so well, governments were setting the price of milk and sugar and bread artificially below their market clearing price, see how productive we are, see how well off we are. I would tell you that's the exact opposite. Well, labor is just the inverse of that. And so when you say we're going to set an artificially high labor rate above its market clearing price, see how productive we are, see how well off we are, I would just tell you no. All you've done is cause a bunch of minority initial entry labor participation to plummet, because the people who most need that first rung on the economic ladder you just sawed off out from under them are going to take a hit, because that's what happens. But your point is well taken that labor rates are rising. That's true. But that's not, while that's useful for the family that receives it, and that's absolutely certainly true, it's also a signal. And here's the signal, and why people like me who are looking at the data are concerned. Let me give you the inverse story, and I think you'll see it better. If I told you, if we were looking at a deep depression, at what point do you think unemployment would be at its very highest? When would the most people be out of work, right? It'd be at the nadir. It'd be at the very bottom of the depression, right? It'd be at the end, as the depression was now starting to turn, right? That would have been the signal that you were at the bottom. You were at a turning point, right? Likewise, now here's the inverse and the counter argument. When you see labor force participation rising rapidly, you see rising costs of labor, you're watching a margin squeeze. The companies themselves are going to have less and less profit. When you see that maximum labor force participation, this is the mirror image of what I just described at the depths of the Depression. You're watching a phenomena that happens at the top of a market cycle. This is the turn, right? When every, when labor gets so stretched and the expansion's gone far enough along that you've really reached quasi-maximum employment, if you could say that, that is the point when the economy is going to turn and reverse and start back down. And so while people look at that and they're rightfully joyed that that's a good sign for individuals, it's good for families that are benefiting from that, you should recognize what that symbol is portending, right? It's telling you something that's not necessarily good news. So for me, look at indicators like one of the leading indicators of a recession, which I actually think we've already slipped into. One of the leading indicators for that is to watch the government's tax receipts from corporations. It's a phenomenal leading indicator, one of the few, and really, really robust. I mean, it's borne out, I think, 14 or 15 of the last 16 times. It's a really good bellwether. And that turned back in September, I think. Brilliant macro folks like Keith McCullough's hedge eye looked at the data and September 30th said, folks, we're going into quad 4. We're going into slowing growth and slowing inflation. And nailed it, man. They just nailed it. So it's easy to focus on the good news and say, yes, labor rates are rising, labor participation is rising, labor wages are rising. But ask yourself, what's the other side of that coin? If labor rates are going up, if labor costs are going up, and labor costs are the largest component of corporate earnings, what is that going to do to corporate earnings, margin squeeze, productivity, right? These things balance each other. And I would just tell you that, but let's go back to your original question. What can the Fed do about it? Not a damn thing, in my opinion. The Fed, in large part, caused the malinvestments that have led us to send capital to unproductive uses because the Fed manipulated money and interest for their own purposes. Again, not because they're evil, diabolical henchmen sitting around stroking a white cat and plotting world domination. Would it were that simple. These are well-intended people who are dangerous, all the more so, because they're well-intended. And they're like children throwing the dials of a nuclear reactor they don't understand. So what can they do now? They're in a crisis mode. They have been for over 10 years, right? When you just turn on the spigots and create $4.5 trillion of currency out of thin air, that's not rational. That's not. Now everybody thought, in my circles, thought, well, that's hyperinflation. Here we go, right? You're going to see massive price inflation. What you saw instead was they didn't put that money in circulation, just gave it to their own banks and held it, right? So look at what you did see. You saw massive price inflation on homes in the Hamptons, in artwork, luxury yachts, right? Where that money spilled into the economy from their hands, you saw the assets they were chasing explode in value. But it didn't reach the average person yet. But it will. Has no choice.
Now let me ask you something, Kevin. I wanna follow through on this. And my next question to you is, how does the government come in here? Because in the Obama days, you saw very few fiscal policies that are being enacted. He basically left monetary policy to run the economy. But Trump, since the day he came in, it's been very different. Deregulation and a lot of obviously the corporate the tax cuts across the board, infrastructure program that's being toyed around with, the new trade deals. So fiscal policy is taking over or becoming much more important, and he's marginalizing the Fed by saying that they're the greatest threat to our economy, even toying around with the idea of firing the Fed chair or just having more communication with them, definitely less independence. I've heard commentators that say that he wants to nationalize the Fed. Obviously in private talks, not anything public yet. But there are many differences between Obama and obviously other presidents that came before that allowed the Fed to do what they want, and Trump that's publicly criticizing them. And then I hear Jamie Dimon talking about, and not only Jamie Dimon, but this is one example, talking about what we call private-public partnerships, which is basically how the government incentivizes companies to go into distressed zip codes, distressed areas, and start to rejuvenize their economies, which is akin to doing some sort of a universal income, but on a greater planning level, because all you're doing is shifting companies' focus to where you want by incentivizing them. So obviously some tax breaks on the real estate that they buy there, or whatever it is that he's going to offer them. But yeah, we see millions of people displaced at early 40s, and their job has been, that's it. It's been outsourced. Their profession's gone, or the company has left the city. There's so many things that are happening to change people's lives within their career. Obviously, you're a living testament of it. You had multiple careers as well. So, the average person needs to keep on learning now, and needs to keep on reinventing himself. And many people are not cut out for that in a capitalistic society like America. It is what it is. And my question to you is, do you see the government becoming even more intrusive, or I shouldn't say intrusive, even more involved in the labor market, in all industries, in education? Is this becoming more socialistic? Because obviously you see that people like taxing the rich in the latest surveys, and that's basically my question to you.
Yeah, no, I think you've got it exactly right. So, first of all, Obama was the guy that kicked off the current round of the currency wars. Now Trump has continued with the trade wars, but Obama started the currency wars in 2010, made an announcement that he wanted to quintuple U.S. trade exports around the world. Well, you only do that by devaluing your currency. And so he announced a currency war in 2010. And yes, he left the Fed alone. That's because largely the Fed was doing what he wanted them to do, which is, by his theory, the wise men at the top could steer an economy and control it for their purposes. Trump sees the world completely differently. It's why he chose, in my opinion, Andrew Jackson's portrait to hang in the Oval Office. Not because he was a huge fan of Andrew Jackson's Cherokee policy, but because Andrew Jackson's singular claim to fame in his own eyes, the thing he wanted as an epitaph on his tombstone, was that he killed the bank. Well, the bank he's referring to was the second U.S. Fed. They came up with a better name because they got smarter marketers, but it's just the third U.S. central bank. The first one was killed by Thomas Jefferson after Hamilton's creation. The second one was killed by Jackson, and it was his greatest pride and joy. So you asked me, did I think Donald Trump was going to take it on somehow? I think if I were the Fed, or if I were the banking cartel behind the Fed, and I saw that man hang a portrait of Andrew Jackson in his office, I'd recognize what was coming. So and to the extent that the president is savaging the Fed, in my mind, quite properly, he's trying to communicate to the public where the source of this disconnect is, where the problem is. Now, one of the results of this, to your point about the rise of an embrace of socialism, this historically happens for two reasons in late stage democracies. The first one is just native, raw sin and evil, right? Everybody would rather steal than work if they could get away with it. People seek the path of least resistance. And socialism puts an imprimatur of approval, almost a sanctification of the sin of envy and jealousy, and turns it into what appears to be a public good. It's not, but in its results are exactly the same. You can turn on your television and watch what's happening in Venezuela to see where that story ends. But there's two reasons for that to happen, not just a collapse of any kind of a moral or ethical base in the country, although that's part of it. The second reason it's occurring is because of the Fed. If you steal from people, if you steal wealth, if you steal from the value of their currency for 70 years, and in the last 10 years, you direct the grift, you direct the graft to the top 1% of your connected cronies, there's going to be a backlash, right? You can't have the disparity in wealth and income. People are fine with that if it's earned wealth and income. People don't really begrudge Jeff Bezos his money or Donald Trump his money before he had the temerity to run for president. How dare he? Or Bill Gates, quite frankly. They look at what they did as creating value, right? So what they greatly resent are the people that are scamming the system, people that are receiving unearned wealth because of their crony connections in Washington, right? That's what people really resent, at least in America. And that's not going to play well. I mean, when you get an idiot like Ocasio-Cortez, who is clearly got an IQ of about 90 or 80, she's just dumb as a post. But yet the powers that be, she won 4,000 votes in the Bronx. Okay. Now all of a sudden she's a national spokesman. When you see a phenomenon like that, you know what you're seeing is that people that are very powerful have decided to use her as a trial balloon to see how far that story can advance before it blows up, to see if America's really ready for this or not. They're going to use her as the sacrificial goat. And if this turns, if the Democrats see a real backlash in their insane socialist policies, they're going to throw her to the wolves. You just dump it all on her. She's an idiot bartender. You'll see that meme change in 24 hours. But until that happens, they're going to keep pushing her out. Think about the news coverage she's getting in the news cycle. Right? She's a freshman congressman. She's got a FICO credit score of 430. There's no business in a country would lend her money, and yet the Democrats just put her on the finance committee, right? Well, there's a reason for that. They're not stupid people. They're corrupt, but they're not stupid, right? She's a scapegoat. So the first thing she puts out is this idiot Green New Deal policy, right? Let's kill all the cattle because they're farting. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. It's a parody, right? When you first read it, you think this is an Onion article, right? This is hysterical. And then she gets 70 co-sponsors, and almost every Democratic presidential candidate signed on. Okay, these people are kind of insane. So for you and your investors listening to this, what does this all mean? What you're watching are the contending of these two titanic forces, right? And it's not, from my perspective, the good guys would be the people who respect, honor, pay fealty to what I jokingly call Massengill's iron law of economics, right? It's just like the law of gravity. And it doesn't matter if you believe in God, don't believe in God. You step off a building at 7 stories and above, you're about to learn a major life lesson. Same thing with Massengill's iron law of economics. Violate it at your peril, right? There are inevitable outcomes, inexorable outcomes, slower than you hitting the ground from 7 stories, but just as impactful and just as inevitable. I'm going to trademark it because in this generation, nobody's ever heard of it, even though it's a very ancient idea. Really simple, 4 words. Thou shalt not steal, right? That's Massengill's iron law of economics, updated for the modern age. And here it is in a nutshell. Societies that respect that, honor that, venerate that, organize themselves in honor of that, have specific outcomes, just as those that disregard it. And what you'll find over time is the creation of property rights regime, a court system, rule of law, contracts, right? You'll find the accretion of capital. You'll find increased productivity. You'll find capital formation, all the good things that attend that, and rising standards of living. Conversely, the society, the nation, the people, the culture, the civilization that rejects that premise, thou shalt not steal, will find the opposite. Everything goes in reverse to what I just said. You find capital flight. You see a degradation of living standards, a degradation of productivity, a rejection of the rule of law, a rejection of contracts and property, and court system breaks down, and you find greatly reduced living standards and widespread poverty. Now, when you look at those two systems and you see their two outcomes, we then slap names on them as though these were designed by smart people that sat down and cleverly thought this all through. We slap a name, we call capitalism to one, we call socialism to the other. In point of fact, they're not systems. They're just results. They're just outcomes. And so my point to all that is what you see in Venezuela is the path we're on now. Because Venezuela was as wealthy as any country on earth, and they destroyed themselves by their idiotic policies that rejected the idea thou shalt not steal. And so they had capital flight, degradation of living standards. Their brightest, smartest people just left, and they're all running businesses in other countries outside of Venezuela. And the people that remain keep voting for Chavez, voting for Maduro, because they have embraced the idea that theft is good, socialism's good, I have a right to live at the expense of my neighbor, screw the rich, and how dare you try to climb out of the cook pot, while I am eating my dinner, right? This idea that somehow the wealthy owe you. Elizabeth Warren's going to tax a wealth tax, not on income, but on what you possess. Okay. Do you think that, one, that tells you two things, not just about the corrupt state of her mind. It tells you the corrupt state of the country as she sees it. She wouldn't champion that if she didn't think it was going to give her a leverage into power, right? If she thought the whole country would recoil at the idea, which of course they should, she would never say it, right? Just like pretending to be a Native American. She only did it because she knew there was a benefit for her, whether that was favored job promotions, favored treatment in academia, right? There's incentives.
Kevin, just to give you a taste of what I think, the politicians, they always, for in the alternative media, they always look like they're from out of space, like it's another breed, but it's not. Politicians, they grow in our neighborhoods, and they choose to go into politics or to banking or to whatever. It is a product of our society, like it or not. So I couldn't agree with you more on that. I want to ask you, Kevin, about what's happening right now in Italy, where you see the deputy prime minister saying that the central bank should be reduced to zero. That's quite a statement. The financial regulator should be reduced to zero. Any banker that aided in the idea of making savings irrelevant and cheating the people out of them should go to prison. And now, yesterday or the day before this interview, or 2 days before this interview, he went on to say that the central bank should give the gold back to the people. This is quite the change, and obviously coming from a country that brought the ECB Mario Draghi. And obviously this plays into the rise of populism and everything that Ray Dalio is saying, comparing right now to the late 30s, not in the sense that there must be a war, but in the sense of the wealth gap, in the sense that there's a rising power and an established power like back then, and in the sense that we just went through a great recession, as we went through a great depression, and then they stimulated, lowered interest rates, very keen stuff. And so my question to you basically is, what sort of investments work in this sort of period, or but let me broaden it a little bit. Is diversification more important than concentration right now, or is it in the reverse? Are you gunning one sort of asset class? Are you saying things can go either way from here? I can see multiple scenarios. I'll let the opportunities come to me, and I'll just diversify and make probably less money. But on the flip side, I'll take far less risk. So, talk about your risk appetite right now and your confidence level in predicting which asset classes would soar, would boom, etc.
Wow. Okay. So first of all, let me salute the Italian Prime Minister. What he is doing is exactly what needs to happen globally and what needs to happen in the United States. We don't need a banking cartel to manipulate money and interest to have a modern economy. That is just naked theft of the powerful from the many in a way that John Maynard Keynes described that not 1 in 1,000 understands. So let me just put that stake in the ground. God love him. Good luck. Godspeed. The very best thing that could happen to this country in America would be to dynamite the Federal Reserve and turn our currency back into the free market and let people's savings and decisions drive the economy and stop having a group of kleptocrat, narcissistic, insane professors think they're smart enough to set money and interest rates. I mean, it's just insanity. To your question about how to survive this, I would tell you now is not a time to be trying to think about how to make a lot of money. Now is a time to just try to protect what you've got, because we're going to sail into some really hard times. And when this happens, first of all, this has never happened in human history. You've never had a situation where the entire world has gone off of a commodity standard like a gold standard and gone on to what Jim Grant calls the PhD standard, with this insane printing of currencies, right? That's never happened. Somewhere in the world, always, there was somebody that hadn't just run right off that cliff. Not anymore. Not since 1971, when we came off the gold standard and everybody else was tied to the gold through us. So what that means is the world now is awash with monopoly money. You have quadrillions of dollars in derivatives risk nobody can even bound or understand. You have trillions of dollars of currency, units that, they're not dollars, they're just currency digits and bits of colored paper. They are the ghost of money, in Thomas Jefferson's words, and they've flooded the world with this just junk, right? There's going to be a reset, a rebalance, against real assets, because the whole world is coming to realize we've overdone it. There's this massive debt, 300% debt to GDP. I mean, it's just insane numbers. There will be a reckoning, and that means when that reckoning happens, all of those currency units will be blown up. They'll just be wiped away. And that's a good thing. It should happen. But here's the bad thing for your listeners. If your assets are tied to the value of that monopoly money, you are at enormous risk. Your pensions, your 401ks, your stock holdings, your anything tied to that currency, your bonds, it's all garbage. It's all currency. It's all a con. And it works right up until it doesn't, right? Hemingway's famous phrase, how'd you go bankrupt? Well, gradually at first and then all at once. It's going to be the same thing for the tipping point when these countries all just realize the game's up. So then what will happen is they will rebalance their currencies against their gold that they have. Not because they've all sat around and read Jim Rickards' brilliant book, A New Case for Gold, or they read Ron Paul, or they've read Ludwig von Mises and they got religion, they understand reality. No, it's because nobody will trust each other. You've been printing currency like it's insane. I've been printing monopoly money. How in the world do we set our trading prices? I don't trust your money anymore, and you trust mine. We all go back to gold because we don't have any choice. It's the only objective value, right? That's why it'll come back. So what that means is gold will be repriced against the flooded currency, against this currency. Well, if you look at a chart of the M2 of the developed countries divided by their gold holdings, the gold goes to over $60,000 an ounce. The U.S. goes to like $55,000 an ounce just from the U.S. dollar. And that's simply a function of how much currency they've jacked into the system, right? So my point to your listeners is the more tangible assets you can get into, whether that's gold, whether that's silver, whether it's real estate, preferably income producing real estate, whether it's a real business, right? A real service provision that people need, not pet grooming. I mean, something that's got some sticking power in a major depression or recession. Those are real assets. They're not going away. They'll be there the next day and the day after that. you just want to move your assets as close as you can to those kind of primary sources of wealth. Gold and silver bullion. Today, I'd say overweight in silver, given the extraordinary gold-silver ratio disconnect, which is another indicator of the beginning of the end. And no, it's not the end of the world, right? It's going to be very painful for a lot of people. It's a horrible rebalancing, but it is. You can think of it as the necessary recovery, the necessary drying out period that a drug addict has to go through. It's the recovery, right? It's what gets you healthy again and saves your life. It's not horrible. It feels horrible. It will suck going through it, but it is a necessary thing to do when you're coming off of a now 10-year, but it's been running since the early 70s, credit binge of unreality, of the malinvestments, the buildings that start to go up, there's nobody to rent them, the shopping malls that are ghost towns, those are all malinvestments, and it has to all get sorted out before we can get back on a real economy, a real economic footing, and kind of get going again. For your listeners, the way you survive that, the way you come out on the other side and maybe actually thrive, is get a portion of your assets into precious metals, get a portion of your assets as much as you can into things that aren't going away. Agricultural land, agricultural production, real estate, income producing real estate preferably. Get some rental houses. Do what you can. If that's a stretch beyond where you're at right now, start getting out of debt. Do everything you can to get out of debt. And have some food and water at hand, and just know that things are going to get a little tough, but it's not the end of the world. We'll come out the other end. The only caveat I give to that is if you see Elizabeth Warren or anybody that spouses those insane policies become president, it really is the end. Your end is what Venezuela is going through right now, and you should join all the other Atlas-type characters like me and step off, because we all will. We're not, and that's not some Hollywood politician bullshit because they didn't like a political candidate. That's a major trend shift. And if that happens in this country, there's going to be a ton of smart people in Capitol go, see ya. Just like what happened in Venezuela.
Kevin, where can people check out your website?
So Meraglim.com, Meraglim, Meraglim is probably a great place to start. We publish a ton of stuff there on our blog, and again, let me disavow, half of what I just said. Jim would not agree with. He's much more conservative. He would tell you 10% of your assets in precious metals, for example, and keep some bonds and cash. And I would do the Nassim Taleb. I'd tell you, I think 80% in bullion would be better, but we see that differently. But we'd love to have you to come check it out, and we wish you good luck in what's coming.
Kevin, thank you very much for taking the time today.
My pleasure, Lior. Have a great day.